Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shannon Q. Oh, I'm getting feedback for a second. I'm really excited today so that we're going to have, a wonderful debate between two people that I really enjoy watching interact. So today we are going to be having a debate as to whether or not the woman in adultery passages in John's gospel are in fact original to the gospels, or if there is some sort of interpolation, later addition, or embellishment. I practiced that and I still wasn't able to do it as accurately as I wanted to. So they'll elaborate on it a little bit. If there's going to be this is going to be a formal debate. So they will be in timed sections. The way that the formal debate is laid out is written out in the description if anybody is interested in having a look. But it will be two 12-minute openings. If it takes that long, that's the allotted time. And then 8 minutes of responses to the openings, and then 20 minutes of cross-examinations in 4 to 5 minute segments each. And then after that, we will be opening up to audience questions. If you have a question in the live chat, please make sure that you tag Paulogia. He's in there saying hi to everybody, I'm sure already. He's going to be aggregating those questions for me, and I will be watching the super chats. We will not be asking those questions in real time so as to not interrupt the debate itself. I'm sure goodness, sorry. My live stream started super professional, so as to not interrupt the debate like I would have done just there. He's going to be aggregating those questions and he's going to be sending them to me when we hit the Q&A section, and I will monitor super chats. And as always, if you send a super chat, thank you so much for supporting the channel. If not, we're still going to make sure that we get questions in because it's important that we have some interaction. So I'm going to introduce our two participants this evening. So first, on the pro side, somebody who thinks that it was original to the Gospels, I would like to introduce John, and John's channel is in the description. So John, tell everybody who you are and where they can find you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and thanks, Shannon, for having us on your show today. But my name is Jonathan Sheffield. I am an Anglican Christian, and over the last couple of years, I have really dedicated myself to understanding the reliability of the New Testament and actually defending the texts of the received churches and defending such passages as a woman in adultery and the last 12 verses of Mark. On my channel, I put together a nice little compilation of cartoon animations really geared to help breaking down this sometimes highly technical subject and explaining what it means in terms of the reliability of the New Testament. So you can check me out on my YouTube channel at Jonathan Sheffield to see what I have going on there. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, John. And our next participant is my friend Chris, who I saw on Steve's channel ages ago, and he was able to communicate with Mr. ID, and I decided that we needed to be friends, and now we are. So thanks for joining us, Chris. Tell everybody who you are and where they can find you, and his link for his channel is in the description as well.
So hi, everybody. That was great. She was also the one that got me onto Twitter because she was like, "What's your Twitter?" And I was like, "I don't have one." And she was like, "Why the fuck not?" So yep, ended up you can find me on Twitter, Biblical History Skeptic, and also then on YouTube, or you can email me at biblicalhistoryskeptic32ad@gmail.com. It's long as all hell. I apologize for that, but yeah, I have been interested for a long time in biblical history and textual criticism. Particularly, I love the textual criticism of the New Testament. So I am going to be arguing completely from the line that it was not original. So, yeah.
Thank you both. So we have agreed on a format. We are going to adhere to the format. And we also agreed ahead of time that John would be presenting first. So I am going to turn the floor over to John, and he is going to tell us why the story of the adulterous woman was in fact original to the Gospel of John. So please go ahead, John. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you again, Shannon, for having me on. And I'd also like to thank Chris for discussing this important issue with me. Now, in order to understand the scholarly consensus against the genuineness of John 7:53 through 8:11, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the historical development of this school of thought on which modern scholarship relies so heavily to support their hypothesis that the pericope de adultery was interpolated into the text of the New Testament and not original to the text of John's Gospel. Now, the development of these interpolation theories begins when Hort in 1881 introduces a theory explaining the creation of readings like the woman in adultery, a theory that would also in turn nullify the commonly received text of the Apostolic Church's testimony by basically relegating thousands of independent witnesses down to essentially one. Now, accordingly, in the face of the extant manuscript testimony, Hort stated that the natural presumption would be that a majority of extant documents is more likely to represent a majority of ancestral documents at each stage in the transmission than vice versa. Hort understood the problem because as it stands now, as was in his day, there are currently 1,476 extant Greek manuscripts that actually contain the passage. And there are about 268 extant Greek manuscripts that do not contain John 7:53 through 8:11. And to be clear, as it was in Hort's time, their theory is based on only a handful of Greek manuscripts, specifically 9. There's Papyrus 66, Papyrus 75, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrius, and Codexes C, N, T, and W. But only 6 of these manuscripts are estimated to date before the 400s, which their theory is dependent on. So their theory is based on this idea that the so-called earlier texts of the New Testament, primarily Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, P75, and P66, are closer representatives to the texts used by the independent Greek apostolic churches prior to the 4th century, and the texts that have come down to us from the apostolic churches are secondary in origin. This is what Dr. Gordon V means when he states Chrysostom's text that was preached on from Antioch is closer to the majority text than it is to any text of the 2nd or 3rd century. And Dr. Ehrman discusses this point in his article titled, "Do Most Manuscripts Have the Original Text?" when he identifies the issue by stating, if they are earlier, aren't they more likely the original? So this theory asserts that there was a change of the text away in the apostolic churches from the originals sometime after the 3rd century. Now, to give viability to this theory, since we're actually dealing with tangible objects, that is manuscripts, you need an editor to create the text and then someone to bring it into the physical churches. So Hort introduced a mechanism to accomplish such a task by proposing a recension at Antioch, whereby Lucan took this passage, the last 12 verses of Mark, and hundreds of other traditional readings common to the received texts of the apostolic churches and conflated them into a standard text that was forced on the Greek churches. Now, the second assertion, which is key to their position as communicated by Neville Birdsall, that since the publication of Hort's introduction in 1881, it had been assumed in most quarters that the text was uniform from the time of Chrysostom, and that this uniform text, called here Byzantium, is to be found in his quotations. Now, if the premise is true, that there was a text forced upon the Greek Orthodox churches, and the extant manuscripts that we have today are based on that exemplar, then the thousands of extant manuscripts would then only represent the testimony of one, not thousands, which would mean Vaticanus and Sinaiticus would represent 2 independent witnesses compared to 1 and would be in the majority. But here's where this school of thought fails. First, while we're aware of Lucan's edition of the Old Testament, which Jerome actually attacked, there is no ancient documentation to show that he ever did an edition of the New Testament, a point that Kenyon admitted had no historical foundation, and Dr. Ehrman stated in my discussion that no one even holds to anymore. And remember, the hypothesis on this passage is that none of the texts received by the apostolic churches had this passage in the original copies. But the majority of Greek and Latin texts ended up with it prior to 382 AD. Now, the passage just doesn't show up ex nihilo, and this school of thought doesn't have a historical mechanism to get it into the majority of texts. Now, second, as Rebuttal pointed out in his study of the Byzantium text in 1965, that more recent investigation has questioned both the uniformity of the Byzantium text and its occurrence in Chrysostom's citation. And Rebuttal concluded in his study, in referring to his own work or its premise, the work of Lake, Lagrange, Caldwell, and Streeter, that it is evident that all presuppositions concerning the Byzantine text or text must be doubted and investigated de novo. Therefore, the thousands of extant Greek manuscripts we have in our possession are actually shown to be independent of each other, not based on a common exemplar, which means they represent thousands of witnesses from different independent streams of the Greek Orthodox churches, which confirms the von Soden study, as pointed out by Dr. Pickering. In other words, while all these theories have been falsified, they continue to hold on to their conclusions. So this school of thought has only offered postmodern narratives, not an actual historical event that occurred. And now, lastly, their so-called best and earliest texts that are deficient this passage cannot be shown to witness to the texts of the Greek Orthodox churches. Since the origins and history of these texts are unknown, even Dr. Carrier in our debate on the last 12 verses of Mark was honest to admit that the provenance of texts of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus cannot be established. We don't know who created these texts, who they belong to, or where they even come from. This is why evidence is vetted at pretrial hearings before being introduced at trial. Whereas the provenance of the Latin Vulgate can be established, since we know who authored it, Jerome, who was secretary of the Pope and was trained in Greek by Gregory Nazian, the Patriarch of Constantinople. And in 383, Jerome had included John 753 through 811 in the Gospel of John in the Vulgate. And on two occasions, Jerome describes how he went against his translation project. In the preface to the Gospels addressed to Pope Damascus, Jerome wrote that he had revised the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by a comparison of Greek manuscripts, and only early ones were used. And in Jerome's letter to Marcella, he stated the objective for his translation project was to restore the Latin to the form of the original Greek. And Jerome provides empirical observation for this passage in his treatise against the Pelagians, stating in the Gospel according to John, there is found in many of the Greek as well as the Latin copies the story of the adulteress who was accused before the Lord. In the same composition, Jerome offers an interpretation of John 8:6 and 8:8, recording of Jesus' writing on the ground. Now, Augustine, a bishop in North Africa, actually vetted Jerome's gospel translation against the Greek text, and in almost every passage found nothing to against to. And as Dr. Edward Hills points out, according to Augustine, it was a moralistic objection to the pericope adultery, which was responsible for its omission in some of the New Testament manuscripts known to him. And he states certain persons of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be giving impunity in sinning, remove from their manuscript the Lord's act of forgiveness towards the adulteress. Also, in the 10th century, a Greek named Nikon accused the Armenians of casting out the same account, which teaches how the adulteress was taken to Jesus, saying it was harmful for most persons to listen to such things. So we have two independent witnesses that testify in the ancient world that the passage was being removed from manuscripts, not added. Not to mention, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, quotes the passage at least 9 times and confirms Augustine's view that the congregations had difficulty with the passage, not because it was added, but because of what it seemed to imply. Now, we also know that the Spanish Bishop Pacium appealed to the periscope the adultery from Spain in 370 AD,
2 minutes.
And Dr. Bart Ehrman even admits that the Greek father Didymus the Blind, head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, most likely quoted the passage in the 4th century. And we have Mara of Amida, according to the Syriac chronicle associated with Zacharias Rector, who obtained the Greek manuscript from Alexandria, which contained the passage, as well as Paul of Tella, who also obtained the Greek manuscript at Alexandria, that also had the passage. Now, Fessus the African, Rufinus at Aquila, Chrysologus at Ravenna, and Sedellus the Scot all quote the passage coming into the 5th century. And what we see is, now the polity of these churches, as evinced in the writings of Tertullian, Eusebius, and Irenaeus, documents that the churches can establish a legal chain for the text through the succession of bishops going all the way back to the apostles. And the texts that have come through these lines in North Africa, Rome, Milan, Alexandria, Spain, the Greek churches, all witness to these readings as the official writings of the text. We know in the Greek church when this passage was actually read before the congregations on St. Pelagius Day on October 8th. Apart from the Old Latin and Greek textual traditions, the passage is found in a number of the Bohairic version, the Ethiopic version, the Palestinian Syriac, the Georgian, the Armenian, the Slavonic, Arabic, and Persian versions. So if the passage wasn't interpolated, we need to ask who added it and where, and how did they get it into the majority of Greek and Latin churches without anyone noticing? And there I conclude mine.
Sorry, you're 13 seconds over. That's pretty good. Oh. That's not so bad. Thank you very much, John. So, Chris, you are currently muted. If you don't mind unmuting yourself, I will make sure that your camera is presenting. Let me know when you're ready.
I'm good.
All right, Chris, I am resetting the timer. You have 12 minutes, although you're quite certain that you won't take that long.
Yep,
and
very certain.
Your time is starting now.
So, yeah, what Jonathan said is all fairly accurate. The Pericope adultery is mentioned in several earlier church fathers. What is interesting, though, to note is that it is not mentioned by any church fathers I know of before Didymus the Blind. The only exception to that could possibly be Papias. And so I'm going to discuss the church fathers first here, just to clear it up. So Papias references a possible allusion to it with, in one of the quotations from Eusebius. And in it, he relates that there seemed to have been a story of a problematic woman or adulterous woman, and it was in the Gospel of the Hebrews. Now, there are two options for this. There was a gospel, according to the Hebrews, that we know of, that was an apocryphal work, not a part of the canon at all, and never was. But or it could also be referencing the Gospel of Matthew. We know for a fact that there, to my knowledge, is not a single manuscript in the entire world that has the Pericope adultery in the Gospel of Matthew. So if Papias is actually referencing it, he is referencing the story as coming out of apocryphal work, not from the Gospel of John. Other church fathers that don't mention this passage and early manuscripts, I found it interesting that he didn't bring up that the Diatessaron from the 2nd century does not mention at all the Pericope adultery. Clement of Alexandria doesn't. John Chrysostom, Cyprian, Origen, Tertullian, Nonus, Cyril of Alexandria, and Cosmas all do not ever mention this passage. It is absent from the majority of all of our Greek lectionaries. It is absent from 6 out of 23 old Latin manuscripts that we have. It is absent from the vast majority of all Syriac manuscripts, and absent from the Sahidic Coptic dialects. It is absent from the Gemara Gospels. It is absent from many Armenian. It should also be noted that the Armenians relocate the passage. They do not have it in its original place. The ones that do have it. It is absent from Gothic manuscripts, from Georgian manuscripts. It is absent from a good number of our minuscules. It is absent from Unicels 0141 and 0211. It is absent from Petronius Porpius, Macedoniensis. The list is endless. Then there's a good number of the manuscripts that do have it, but actually have little asterisks or little colophon mark that means that they were questioning its authenticity or did not think it was original. Those that question it include one of the Codex Vaticanus 354s. Several minuscules question it. With a little obelisk, Codex Basiliensis, Codex Tischendorfensis 3. That list is also endless. All of this is very indicative of it not having been original, or that it may have been an older tradition that was floating around and being added. And other evidence of this actually also includes, for example, the Family 1 manuscripts, which are actually very, very late. And it's interesting that these late manuscripts, long after this time, are still we're still finding it in different places or absent. The Family 1 manuscripts date from the 11th to the 13th century AD. And they relocate it after John 21. The Family 13 manuscripts, again, also late, they place it in the Gospel of Luke. And they place it after Luke 24. Then there are 2 minuscules that we have that place it after Luke 21. And then there are others that include it after 736, John 736, and then others that place it after John 21:25. It can be all over the place in the manuscripts, even late down the line when these things were starting to become standardized with things like the Vulgate. We are still finding it all over the place. And this is evident that there were multiple tradition lines all that had this story in them, but that was a free-floating story that was being added at different places. Hence, we find it at completely different intervals in the stories. There's like he said, there are some church fathers that mention them. The earliest one is, again, Didymus the Blind. But what is interesting is that until Jerome, there's not a single church father that actually mentions it as being a part of the Gospel of John. If I remember correctly, Didymus the Blind, while he quotes the passage, doesn't actually cite where he quotes it from. I could be wrong on that. If I am, I hope Jonathan can correct me on that. There are. I find it interesting, though, that if we're arguing for the authenticity of this passage and the absence of it from our earliest church fathers, especially church fathers like Origen and Tertullian, speaks miles about its provenance in the church. The fact that it is absent from all over around Christendom. One of the tactics that I have seen Jonathan use in the past is to argue that is the multiple lines of tradition that contain it. But there are also innumerable lines of transmission that don't have it or supplant it somewhere else. Augustine talks about how it was being removed by some churches in it because they thought that it could have been used as a condoning of adultery and stuff like that. The problem with that is that Augustine is not even talking until the 5th century. This is after the Vulgate was already a thing. So at this point, he's already talking about the text after it's already being starting to be standardized. So, and long after whether we would be talking about whether or not it was really original, at this, it is interesting that though that the only early church father that quotes it, Didymus the Blind, from around these earlier periods, to my knowledge, doesn't even quote where it's from. And then the only other one that talks about it is Papias, and Papias thinks that it's from a Gospel of the Hebrews. Given that, I don't see any good reason for supposing that it was original. Now, how it would have ended up being passed into the major lines of transmission is fairly easy, actually, because after the 5th century, a good number of Bibles were then being standardized based on the Vulgate translation, and then also it then became, after that, more prevalent in other manuscripts. For example, the Armenian manuscripts, which I mentioned earlier, a lot of them do not have it, but those that do, as I mentioned, completely transplant it, evidence that it was not originally in John, or it's being supplanted, or that it's a free-floating story. So yeah, overall, I just don't think that there is any good reason to think that, especially that the early church fathers don't mention it. It's not in our earliest manuscripts, and it's not even in the Diatessaron. That's all.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. All right, so Chris, you were just around 9 minutes. So very good. I'm going to reset my stop. I am awful at multitasking. And now there's going to be an 8-minute response to each other's openings. So John, you will go first. I will present you and mute myself. Please start whenever you'd like, and I'll start the timer.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Chris. I think Chris brought up a lot of good points, and there's a lot of things that need to be discussed on this point. Now, regarding the illusion of the payas, which gives us an indication of, let's go ahead and investigate where this information is coming from. And once again, we have notable bishops who had access to the text early in the 4th century, which Ambrose at Milan quotes it, talks about the problems that caused in the congregation, but doesn't say it was added at all. Augustine in North Africa. Jerome found it in both the Greek and Latin, and the basis for his revision was not to alter or change the text, but restore it to the original Greek form, and he used old Greek manuscripts that had that. But there's a couple of things that Chris brought up about the lectionary that I think it's important to actually maybe explain a couple of these things. So first, now Hort also echoed the effect that John 7:15 is absent in the ancient lectionaries. Now this is only partly true. The passage is not included in the Scenarium. Now that's the movable part of the lectionary in which the dates are annually reset so that the reading list begins at Easter, regardless of what day of the year it is. But most of the passage is included in the Monologium. Now, that's the part of the lectionary in which readings are assigned to specific dates of the year in honor of saints, martyrs, and etc. Now, in the Monologion, John 8:2-11 or John 8:3-11, depending on the local usage, is arranged as the readings for Saint Pelagia of Antioch. And this was done on October 8th. And in those lectionaries, the overwhelming majority of it supported for that reading. Now, Chris did talk about that there are certain parts of it found. Now, let's talk about some of these phenomenons that are happening in terms of the various locations of the passage. Now, in some copies, it's at the end of the Gospel of John. In other copies, it's not in the Gospel of John, but can be found at the end of Luke 21, which James White states, such moving about of a body of text is plain evidence of its later origin. And Daniel Wallace, who states that it was a textual butterfly looking for a home. Now, White had mentioned that in Minuscule 225, the PA is found in John 7:36. and stated that this is plain evidence of its later origin. Now, what is plain, however, is White didn't realize that that this, in another way, is which copyists simplified the lector's job by placing the PA immediately before the entire text of the lection for Pentecost, allowing the Pentecost lection to become an uninterrupted block of text. In the same manuscript in 225, John 13, 3 through 17, is found not only in the Gospel of John, but also in the text of Matthew, after Matthew 26:20. This adaptation conforms to a lection cycle that was annually read at Easter time. The claims that the movement of the PA to, before, or after the text of Pentecost lection implies that it was a floating passage has no more merit than the notion that John 13, 3 through 17 was a floating passage. Now, in regards to where we find it in Luke, it's also an adaptation to the lection cycle. Because after John 7:53, 8:11 was removed from the text of John in order to format the Pentecost lection as one continuous block of text, the excess passage was transferred to a location where it would conveniently follow the previous day's lection in the monodeon, or the lectionary. Earlier in Luke 21, verses 12 through 19, serves as the lection for October 7th, the feast day of Saint Sergius and Bacchus. Now, the next convenient insertion point after Luke 21:19 is the end of the chapter. And the contents of Luke 21:38, then early in the morning, all the people came to him in the temple to hear him, naturally invites the insertion of the lection for the next day, October 8th, the feast day of the penitents. And as shown in Ferrara in Abbott's 1887, a collection of 4 important manuscripts, the text of the Periscope Adultery and the Family 13 manuscripts was adjusted in order to interlock with the end of Luke 21. In the main members of Family 13, John 8, 2b through 3a has been excised in order to avoid repeating some things which are related in Luke 21:37. So what we see here, and I think there's a couple of things to understand, that various commentators state that these marks and all these things are shown that it wasn't original, is completely explained in understanding how the church formatted the readings of passages of scripture in accordance to the ecclesiastical calendar. And this is what we see in a number of these manuscripts. Now, he does bring up that a number of Greek fathers do not preach on this passage. Now, in regards to Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria, they were following. So, in regarding Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria, well, they were following the lection cycle, and the portion that was following for Pentecost skips over that portion as indicated in the lectionary cycle. But it's still witnessed in the overwhelming Greek churches. It's part of their lectionary system. It's an official reading of the text. And now Didymus doesn't say where he got it from, now, given he was blind, but he did say in the Gospels. And where else do we find this reading, but in John? The 4 texts of Luke that have it in it is explained from the lection cycle. But the thing about it is we have a manuscript of Matthew that has the account of Jesus being stabbed by the spear by the Roman centurion. But this only occurs in John, and that's one manuscript that has it, but it doesn't explain all the ones that do. And in the majority of ones that do have it, it is in that section of John. Now, Chris did bring up about Tatian's harmony. Well, here's what we know about the Syriac, or the Peshitta in particularly. Now, the Peshitta not only doesn't have the PA in most of it, the Palestinian, the Aramaic one does. So it does witness to it. Secondly, the Peshitta doesn't have revelation. Second Peter, Second and Third John, and Jude. So we understand that there's a number of problems with that. The early Arminius text did, and the Coptic Bohairic, of the 38 copies that we have, 14 of them have it. So
time.
Okay.
8, 10. But some of that was me saying time. John, good job. Thank you very much. Chris, are you ready? You all set? Chris, you're still muted, my friend.
Yeah, I just unmuted.
Fantastic. Thank you for everybody who's saying like and share in super chats. I'm not sure if I can ask those as questions, but so I'll say it now. Thank you, Reese. Thank you, Brian G. Thank you, Vibrantly Brandt, and thank you, Vibrantly Brantley. Sorry, and thank you, Modern Day Debate. Modern Day Debate's a great channel, by the way. You should go subscribe to that channel.
Yeah, everyone subscribe to James.
Yes, James's channel is fantastic. He's like the male Christian me. Only not as pretty. He'll never be as pretty as me.
No.
All right, Chris, are you ready? All right.
Yeah.
Once you start talking, I'm going to start the timer and you'll have 8 minutes. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so I did find it interesting when he noted the lectionaries that Jonathan, you didn't mention to note that actually several of the lectionaries that do have it and have it relocated and stuff actually have little asterisks or oboli that question its authenticity. And we know that, and we know from numerous other Greek manuscripts and from the way that New Testament fathers worked is that these asterisks and oboli were used to question authenticity, not just to question, not just to say that, oh, well, this might have been moved or something like that. For example, it is questioned in the lectionary 185, and then in the Menologia of others, such as 86, 211, 1579, and 1761. So when the lectionaries do contain it, and there are numerous that don't even, most of them don't even have it in the Menologion. Even those that do have it, much of the time they question its authenticity, which I find is rather interesting for something that was, according to Augustine, supposed to be just standard and known from most of our manuscripts. There's the issue you didn't. I found it interesting you didn't address the diatessaron not having it. I don't know. That's not following the lectionaries, to my knowledge. Neither was Clement of Alexandria, or Origen, or Tertullian, or Nonus, to my knowledge. And I don't think Cosmas was either. I don't know for sure about Cosmas. There is the problem that the provenance of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are questioned a little bit. Sinaiticus a little less so, especially considering it actually retains a lot of the more standard readings that we find in a ton of our other manuscripts, though it has some pretty variant ones. It's an early manuscript. That's where most of our variants take place, is in the earliest ones. I find it interesting that of all of these bishops and people that you say had access to it and included it, only 3 of them are actually from the 4th century or before. And that's going to be Didymus the Blind, Ambrosiaster, and Ambrose. Augustine is 5th century, Jerome is 5th century, or moving in there. The Vulgate in particular is moving towards the end there, because the earliest script in the entire world that contains it at all is the Didascalia, which, to my knowledge, doesn't actually quote where it's from. So it is interesting to me, though, that the only manuscript that we have also of the 5th century or after that, aside from the Didascalia, is Codex Bezae. And that's the only one that has it. And it's interesting also because the Codex Bezae is also known for its rather abnormal and erroneous readings much of the time. It is one of the most unique. So I am having a little issue with some of the evidence that you're providing. I am glad you did properly note, yes, that the Family 13 and Family 1 manuscripts are following along those lectionary cycles and everything. So it's that partially why part of the relocation, although there are several manuscripts that are not following those that still relocate it. And I did mention a few of those that do not seem to be following that, but still relocate the passage elsewhere. Yeah. Other than that, I mean, there's also like the Codex Vaticanus 354 and Basilensis that all and Tischendorfensis 3 and Pilotanus, all of which mark it off as being questionable. There's also then, we haven't talked about it much, but there's the shorter pericope as well. We have manuscripts that exclude the shorter pericope, which is 8:3 through 11, and then we also have those that question the shorter pericope as well. And then it should also be noted that despite what he actually said, is that we do have evidence that it was added by later hands. Codex Ebernerianus is a prime example of that, where we know for a fact that it was not originally in that codex, and then a later hand added it. And then it was also done in several others, like 284, 431, 461, 470, 578, and 2174. So yeah, I just it is interesting that we have all those that even when they include it are questioning it. When it's the shorter form are questioning it. We have evidence that it was being added by later hands to the manuscripts, meaning that they were reading. Okay, that they were reading another manuscript that didn't have originally have it, or were writing one that didn't have it, and then someone else was reading another manuscript that did, and then they decided to put it in, or they were hearing it in their church or whatever and put it in there, but it just wasn't originally. And then our earliest reference at all to this passage in the entire world, the Diatessaron, doesn't have it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So you are at 6:32. So now we are going to enter into the Q&A. So I'll ask both of you to unmute yourself. I'm not going to white box anybody, but I will mute myself with the exception of letting you know when the time should switch over. So we have agreed to 4 5-minute segments. And then after that, we will be going into the audience Q&A, which I'm excited for. And also the questions that I'm going to ask, because I need a lot of clarifications. So, John, you will be going first. I am going to mute myself. If you guys could both keep your mics on. And as soon as you start, I will start the 5-minute timer. It's difficult to give you a 2-minute warning with only 5 minutes. So is it okay if I give you 1 so that I'm not interrupting you directly in the middle? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Wonderful. Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. All right, John, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. I guess the first question for Chris is, when did the Greek churches actually get together with the Latin churches to standardize their texts against the Vulgate?
I mean, the first evidence that we have of the standardization going on was when Jerome decided to do it himself when he was translating the Vulgate. But then we do have evidence of them of standardizing the Vulgate in, for example, if I remember correctly, in the 8th century, we have some evidence that they were looking at that. So. To my knowledge, so from what I've seen is that yes, we do have some evidence that they were at least the Catholic Church was standardizing to the Vulgate.
But there was never a council where the Greek churches, because we have lots of information on Jerome's translation, his process, the attacks from Augustine attacking his Vulgate translation. But we don't have a letter from a bishop saying, you know, we're going to conform our text to the Latin Vulgate. where there wasn't a council where the Greek bishops and the Latin bishops got together to do this.
No, there wasn't, but we wouldn't really expect such a thing. I mean, outside of some of the councils of Carthage, we don't have really any evidence that there was even a council for canonization. So
when did the passage get added, and when did I mean, because we have Passian in Spain, which is 4th century, so I had to get into there. It has to get into the old Latin lines of Ambrose. It has to get into the Alexandrian lines as well. And, you know, Jerome said he found it in both Greek and Latin, and his revision was done in 382. That's when he began his gospel translation, finished in 384. So when did it get into all these various traditions? Because it has to be done prior to 382.
I would say it was probably going on at intermittent times through different lines of transmission. Hence why we have it in the Didascalia, but we don't have it in the Diatessaron or Clement or, you know, Tertullian and Origen, all who are very close to the same periods. So it's being added, in my opinion, it's just being added in different lines at different points in time. So there's no set time where it's going to be happening, and then it's just eventually just catches on, especially because orthodoxy was becoming more standardized.
Now, Jerome got attacked when his text went out to North Africa, and the bishop actually noticed a small change in Jonah. And the congregations, the Greeks especially, noticed that there was a small change, and they denounced their translation. So, and which caused an uproar within the Greeks and the church. So, why would not they have rioted against a passage that first they didn't like being added into their text? I mean, when did the Greek churches and Latin churches agree on anything?
Well, I mean, they did agree on quite a few things. I mean, Nicaea was a thing where most of them ended up agreeing on things. So we know for a fact that they did agree on quite a few things. And when it comes to this, yes, there was the riots over that passage being added. But by the time that Jerome's Vulgate was being sent out and circulated, I'm not sure that it was probably so absent from all the text. By that time, I think it was probably being pretty standardized in both Latin and Greek texts. It just wasn't in the earliest ones.
I guess I'll move over to Chris, since there's probably like 30 seconds left. So
yeah, that's a pretty good estimate. There's 34.
Wow, I'm good.
Yeah, you're good, John. You're good. All right, Chris, if you're ready, I'm going to mute myself. And as soon as you start asking your question, I'll start the timer and you'll have 5 minutes and I'll give you a 1-minute warning. Thanks.
Okay. So, Jonathan, first one I want to ask is who is the earliest church father that mentions the pericope as being referenced from the Gospel of John?
Well, Jerome's statement is probably the most conclusive, because he says he found it in the Gospel of John, both the Greek and I think the importance of that is he was well aware of many variants, many texts, and he actually used Old Greek texts as his basis. And what his letter to Marcellus shows is, even though he's being questioned that he was changing anything, his whole purpose was, no, I'm just trying to conform it to the original form of the Greek text. Okay. So he's probably one of the biggest. You are right about Didymus of Alexandria. He doesn't say specifically, but he refers to the Gospels. And where else do we find it but in this section?
Okay, so how do you handle the opinion of Papias? What is your position on Papias?
Well, I think it's interesting, that allusion to the PA. So the first thing is he was aware of a passage, and if it does apply to the PA, the question is when we investigate this, and this is what Tertullian says when he had his debate with Marcion over original readings, that we need to examine the text in the official churches to determine which readings are original. So what that passage does, and what we've seen in a lot of the Gnostic texts, especially Marcion's, is he cribbed from the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul and created his own edition. Now, we don't have any copy of the so-called Gospel of Hebrews that existed, so we can't verify its contents if that was what he was referring to. But we can investigate where do we find this passage. And when we look to the Greek textual tradition, the Latin textual tradition, the old Vetus Latin tradition, while it's not in the majority of the Syriac tradition, we also know that a lot of things aren't in there, such as Revelation and all these other texts that are not in there. That's where we find it. So I think Papia's statement leads us to examine where does this passage come from. And when we look to the churches in Milan, North Africa, in Spain, in Alexandria, they all come up with this reading.
Well, yeah, except for the variant readings. So when we talk about Papias and how he references coming from the Gospel of the Hebrews, I'm sure you and I would probably both agree that there are really only two possibilities we know of that could be referencing, either Matthew, the Gospel of the Hebrews, as it was otherwise called in other church fathers, or the other Gospel of the Hebrews, the apocryphal work, which only survives in a few quotations. With that, if the PA were to come from there, according to Papias, but then we also have another line in the Syriac where it's absent, and you're right where it does mention where they are absent, don't have Revelation, but we also know that was up for a lot of debate within the Orthodox Church. Anyways, so that's not surprising, but the fact that it's also absent then from the Sahidic Coptic manuscripts, the Garima Gospels and Ethiopic Witnesses. What do you make of that?
Well, so once again, Papias's question could have been in the Gospel of Hebrews. Obviously, it could have been the case. We know that a number of the Gnostic sects were cribbing from the known Gospels, because it leads to a question, where did they get this passage from? And when we investigate it, we see it in the majority of independent apostolic churches. Now, in reference to the Coptic Sahidic, now of the 38 that we have, it's in 14 of them. So we understand from Augustine, we also understand from Nikon that it was being removed. And even though I'm going to speculate here a little bit, Chris, but we know the passage created difficulty, and we don't see it in a lot of these areas, because if you look at adultery, how it's viewed to this day in the Middle East, it's a very delicate subject. It does require stoning. We saw in the West, Ambrose and Augustine explained the problems it caused. Nikon said the Armenians were taking out of their text, which explains why some of the Armenian texts don't have it. So, the thing is, we got to look at, we have a couple of independent witnesses saying they were taking it out. And when we look at the instant manuscript testimony, it sort of reflects that, and even reconciles with Jerome's statement that he found in many Greek and Latin, indicating that it was probably not in some. But if we go to the other portion, I have to guess, that because of the conflict this passage would have caused, it explains why it was being removed, especially from those areas. They have a long history of adultery being an issue. I mean, even to this day.
All right. So we are actually a little over a minute over time for that one, but I wanted to make sure you got your full answer into that question because the question was finalized at just a minute too. So now, John, it'll be your turn. And if the extra minute and a half is needed, then I'll make sure that I grant it for you as well. So I'll start the timer whenever you're ready.
Oh, no problem.
Go ahead.
Okay. The first thing, kind of touching on the internal evidence a little bit, Chris, I want to read you a passage from C.S. Lewis, who actually talks about the pericope adultery, and get your comments on it. Now, C.S. Lewis says, I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know what not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are only two possible views. Either this is a reportage of eyewitness testimony, or else some unknown author in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. If it's untrue, it must be narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see that has simply not learned to read. In other words, what's being presented there is like nothing else that's found in that type of literature until the modern novel, which shows that it would have had to been reported by eyewitness testimony. John, who was there, would have been able to record that because it's a special feature. So what do you make of that statement by C.S. Lewis?
Honestly, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on it myself. I can't say I particularly agree with it a whole lot, but I don't really have a whole lot actually that I can really say on it myself.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of a floating tradition. Now, in the Greek Orthodox Church and even in the Western Roman Catholic Church, there's many floating traditions, such as the Assumption of Mary, the Ever Virgin Mary, which are celebrated and revered in both the Greek and Western Church. But none of these actually made it into the text in the Greek or in the Latin tradition. But like the Assumption of Mary, it actually made it into the text of Quran. So where are these cases of these floating traditions actually make it into the text?
Well, I mean, it's harder to pinpoint them when it comes to the Gospels, but I mean, the Assumption of Mary is not exactly a floating tradition in the same sense. Or neither is the Virgin Mary thing, because the floating traditions would be ones that are, when we talk about them, are traditions that are floating between different texts or being added in and out and stuff like that. So that one is more just an oral tradition, which I would categorize as a little bit different. I mean, but with if we were going to go along those lines, so oral traditions that get added into the texts or added into texts, period. I mean, that is exactly how things like the Odyssey ended up being developed, was through a series of oral traditions that were being added to and subtracted from and compiled together. I would also argue that things like the Johannine comma and stuff like that would be evidence of that, but that's a different debate in and of itself.
1 minute.
Okay. Now, quick question, Chris. Now, I know you brought up about the various commentators state that there's marks found in a number of these texts, which they mark as suspicious. But now, what do you make of the approximately 133 or 130 of the approximately 270 manuscripts, which have these accent extracts, actually point to the location for the election of St. Pelagius Day? within that section of the text that was to be skipped on Pentecost. Because
I did note that there are many that do have that. Yes, of course there are several that relocate it for that, but then there are, and I think that's completely consistent with the fact that they were reserving it for the Pentecost cycle. But there is the problem, though, that then there are the numerous others that question it without doing that, leaving it where it is, which are more the ones that I'm taking issue with, including lectionaries like the Menologia of 86 and 211 and lectionary 185.
Oh, Shannon, are we done, or we're up on the?
You are. You're up on. You're at 5:33. I was going to give you a full extra minute just in case you needed it. Do you have a question that'll last about another minute, or do you? Okay.
We can move on to the next one.
I just want to make sure that I'm being fair.
Yeah, no, it's perfectly fine. I think.
Awesome. All right. So, Chris, this is going to be the last segment. If anybody has any questions, make sure you tag Paulogia or send it by a super chat. Paul's already starting to aggregate them for me, sending them to me through messaging systems. So I already have a few, which is fantastic. I'm excited to ask you guys. And we already have one super chat question for you guys already. So, Chris, this is your last segment, and then we will be moving on to the Q&A. So please, I'll start the timer as soon as you're ready.
Okay. First, I just want to thank you, Jonathan, for putting up with this. But
no, it's great. I think it's a really good discussion. So
yeah, okay. So I want to know, what is your thoughts on the fact that the diatessaron from the 2nd century doesn't yet you have it?
Yeah, and though I love Tatian's harmony, I know many church fathers were against him trying to harmonize the text. I think it speaks to the point that this issue of adultery, especially in those areas where Tatian is actually writing from, would be hugely problematic, which goes to the point of, why did the Greek Orthodox Church actually move the reading, out of the lectionary to the day of Saint Pelagius. But it would lead me to believe that because Saint Pelagius focused on repentance, which was the issue in this passage, because it seemed like the adulteress got a free pardon and it condoned what she did, it speaks to allowing that type of mentality, which would not reconcile with the cultural norms of the day. I mean, can you imagine in this day going to those areas in Syria and preaching that we are to forgive adulterers in those areas, which, when we look at the testimony of Nikon and Augustine and even the problems that Ambrose had with it, would have led to its removal or maybe drop from the lectionary altogether. So I can see why that's not included. Tatian's harmony also doesn't include the birth narrative, which
right, correct.
So
okay, so so you think it has that it was part of the problem, so it was moved to possibly coincide with Pelagius Day?
Yeah, that would be
okay. How do you reconcile the fact that Saint Pelagius Day is never mentioned as being celebrated until Ambrose in the 4th century, with the fact that the diatessaron is from the 2nd century? It seems like a large disconnect.
Well, but it was celebrated in the Greek Orthodox churches. The Aramaic churches are a little different. That's another textual tradition. And when we look at it, it's not dependent on just one witness. So if we had to rely just on Tatian, there'd probably be a lot of things that wouldn't be included. The LE would, but I think part of it is, we have the Western textual tradition, which it comes up through the Old Latin and Jerome's Vulgate. It's in the Greek tradition. And and you're right. In the Aramaic textual tradition, a majority of it does not support it, but we do find it in the Palestinian. So it is referenced there. The second century allusion to it, if that's what they're referring to, because it's not an exact quotation, could refer to it as well. But what we do know is that when the church is finally officially after the Edict of Milan, the first time we actually begin to see the text coming out, especially after the dispute with the Arians, is these passages. And we find it in independent centers of Christianity, even in the Aramaic, in a small handful of them. And it's in all these other traditions. So I have to either ask myself, was someone running around the ancient world adding it to all these groups and no one noticing?
1 minute.
Okay.
Or,
well, my final question is going to be this. Given that it's absent in a lot of textual lines, and given that we don't have evidence of it being removed for adultery purposes until the 4th century, that's when it's first being talked, that problem is being talked about first. Couldn't it be just as reasonable that it was being actively removed as it was also just absent from the transmission lines completely?
So it was being actively removed or added?
Well, could it be said that it was that it's just as likely that it was absent from the transmission lines from the start as it was that they were being removed?
Well, I think we have a harder problem. It's one thing to remove a text, and you did bring up a couple of good points that, we do see second and third hands. I mean, even in Sinaiticus, we see where they take out passages, the next hand comes in and adds it back in. Now, any one text could be corrupted and it could be added in. So that's a given. So could there have been lines that it could have been added in? Of course. The problem that I have when we look at the independent testimony from different centers of Christianity is we find it in the Latin. Jerome noticed it in the Greek and Latin. It's in North Africa. It's in Spain. It's in Alexandria. Yeah, it's not in some of the Aramaic areas. It's about maybe a 35-60 split somewhere with the Bohairic. It wasn't some of the Armenian, the Georgian, the Persian.
Wasn't in the majority of the Sahidic or the Syriac.
Yeah. So when we look at the overall, we have to look. Of course, any one text can be altered. We saw that with Marcion's text, all these other Gnostic texts. But how do you get them into all the churches, which becomes a distribution nightmare? And who was willing to accept these changes into their text? I mean, they attacked Jerome, and there was a whole campaign launched against Marcion for what he did to the text. Now we're going to have if we look at the Greek Orthodox Church, they wouldn't change one word in the creed, and it separated the Greek and Western churches for over 1,000 years because Rome wanted them to add something into the creed, just one line.
All right. So we're a little bit over the last segment, but I think that's okay. We're going to move into the Q&A. I have a laundry list of audience questions. So I'm going to start with the super chat that we received, and it is from Demonic Davros. And this will be addressed to both of you, so you can each have an opportunity to decide who goes first. So does the sanctity of marriage need to be recognized by the adulterous parties? Or is it just she is mine and not yours? Is it just she is mine and not yours mentality?
I'll let Chris begin on that one.
Oh, sanctity of marriage. The answer is hard to say, because now we're talking about trying to harmonize the adulterous woman passage, I guess, with what the rest of the New Testament says, but I mean, Jesus made it very clear not to divorce. That the woman is to stay with the man, and the man is to stay with his wife. So unless you decide to ascribe to Mosaic law, I don't know.
Anything to say, John?
Yeah, can you repeat the question one more time?
Yes, of course I can. Absolutely. So the question is, and it's again from Demonic Davros, and thank you very much, Demonic Davros. So, does the sanctity of marriage need to be recognized by the adulterous parties, or is it just a she is mine and not yours mentality?
See how we tie this into the pericope adultery, because once again she's committing a sin against the law, and the Pharisees at that time was correct because the Mosaic law caused actually ruled that she should be stoned in there, and so obviously from the theological side it is trying to uphold the law, and it's trying, because Jesus is basically saying, if you're with me, you have salvation, but outside of Christ, basically go and sin no more. So you have to uphold the law, and it's only in Christ that we receive reconciliation. So he is upholding the sanctity of marriage in that particular passage.
That's an interesting question, because it seems as though if he's allowing an excuse for it, like that, let he is without sin cast the first stone, he's essentially saying that if you do it and also believe in me and accept me as your Lord and Savior and truly believe it in your heart, you'll be forgiven. So it's okay.
Yeah, no, and I know they had problems with that passage because it seems like it kind of condones the sin, where in those areas it would be a riot, just like today would be. But like Jesus tells her, once you leave me, go and sin no more, that you're not going to be protected. So the law isn't necessarily going to apply, but in me, you find salvation and hope.
Could that potentially be, and then I'll get to, there's some fabulous audience questions. There's some on topic, many on topic, and a few adorable, fantastic ones that are off topic. And I'd also like to say thank you so much, Paulagia, for aggregating these for me, because it's very difficult for me to be able to manage the timer and the chat and everything at once. So he's indispensable in that fashion. So thank you. And I've lost track of what I was going to say. I'll just go to the question. So the first question is Pheno 3000, and this is specifically to you, John. Is it even in the interest of apologists to defend that passage, as it is another case where Jesus breaks Old Testament law despite the frequent claim about him being free of sin?
As far as defending the passage, yes. I think from a couple of standpoints, because it speaks to the reliability of the New Testament. So if Chris is correct in his hypothesis that it was added, it speaks against it. So if you think about, there's a contradiction in the New Testament Gospels, and someone was going in to either try to rectify or bring in a theological position, it really speaks against the reliability of the New Testament. But then on the other side of the equation, why would we add that in if it is actually contradicting something in the New Testament?
So it's let me mirror it back to you to make sure that I'm understanding accurately. So it seems as though what you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, is they would have no motivation to add that in because it's tantamount on a surface level to a contradiction to the old law. Whereas Jesus said he was there to uphold the old law, not a jot and tittle and all that. So they would have no motivation to include it. Thus, their inclusion of it must be authentic, Because otherwise, why would they include something that's clearly a potential contradiction?
Yes, and I think you know, what Christ is saying there is that in me you have salvation. Outside of me, you know, you're left in the hands of the law. So I think there's a theological distinction between what the law says and what the gospel promises and provides. So I don't see the contradiction. It would make it kind of rare to throw in a passage that's overly going to contradict what Jesus said elsewhere.
Interesting. Okay. So I have another question before we move on. And most of these questions are to John. Surprise, surprise.
Sorry, Chris. We're all with you.
Yeah. Everybody really wants John to prove his point, apparently. I think that maybe because it seems as though going into this debate, when I don't profess to having a great deal of experience when it comes to, you know, textual criticism and analyzing the history. And I never will, because it's not something I do have, which is why I enjoy participating in these so that I can learn. But in interacting with other people, I came across a lot of how is this even something that's contested? Like, it seems that scholars sort of unilaterally accept that it was an interpolation or a later addition.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know,
it's probably consensus at this point. There's only 3 scholars in the world I know that actually go against that.
That actually go against. Okay, so that brings me to the question, and what my question is, if that seems to be the ultimate consensus, and that it was not included in any of the early manuscripts as far as anybody can tell, and it only appeared later on, is the ultimate defense, as I'm understanding it, that they wouldn't have had any motivation to add this into the text, and because later church fathers did include it, obviously they were drawing it from somewhere, and we can't assess their motivations. And since we can't assess their motivations for doing this, we can just negate it, even though there's no earlier evidence.
Well, I think remember, the theory is really first introduced in 1881. I know some German scholarship at the end of the 18th century, like Reisbach, they started, the question is that there's these other texts that are out there that in some cases are prevalent in the writings of the church fathers that is different than the text that has come down through the churches today. So when they look at that, they said, well, you know, you got these sort of early texts, and then you have these later texts that kind of correlate real well together. Mm-hmm. But it naturally drives when these early texts be closer to the originals. Well, that's if, you know, they witness to it. So the development of this theory really only starts in the 19th century. You cannot find any church father in the 4th century, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, anywhere that came up with this conclusion on the woman in adultery. I mean, Jerome is one of the top textual scholars of the 4th century who was actually dealing with numerous variants and restoring his Latin translation to the form of the original Greek. And while he was aware of variants, he did not come to this conclusion. Erasmus, Stephanus, Tyndale, all their editions during the Reformation, and they dealt with copies that didn't have it. They were aware some texts that were negligent. They didn't come to the conclusion. Now, the consensus theory is based on a worldview that was created with these theories that have all been shown to be falsified. Yet the modern scholarship continues to hold to theories that can't show that actually anything ever actually happened.
Although we do have several earlier manuscripts that do mark it as questionable.
What do you mean by earlier manuscripts that mark it as questionable? Sorry, I like to talk.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to interrupt a little bit. I'm going to be the audience proxy because there's a lot of really thick history here. So I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarification now. So Chris, could you clarify on that for me, please?
So in Greek manuscript writing tradition, they had a system of symbols that they used to use to mark whether or not they questioned a passage of a work, or noting a relocation of a work, noting like a transplantation, or just numerous things. In the Greek manuscripts, in particular of the New Testament, what we find are asterisks and oboli marks being used, and they're used for a few things, mostly when it comes to like the lectionaries and a few manuscript, a good chunk of the manuscripts. It's being used to note that a passage may have been transplanted, but also it's used. They're used to note that these passages are in doubt. Their authenticity is in doubt. And we know this from around 100 or so manuscripts that they would mark off these areas of the Gospels that they found may not have been authentic at all. For example, there is a Menologon of Lectionary 185 that talks about it has the pericope adultery and marks it with the asterisk, despite the fact that it's already actually been put in the Menologia and it's not in the proper reading anyway. So we know for a fact it's not noting the transplanting. We know that it's noting that this passage is, in fact, very questionable in nature. Tischendorfensis 3 notes that as well, and a few other lectionaries. So the oboli and asterisks were used as basically the same way that we do today when we have the passage in our modern translations. Most of them are going to actually bracket the pericope adultery and have a footnote or something saying that, yeah, this is probably not authentic.
Interesting. Okay, so there was a way that they had a system of demarcation so that people would know that it was questionable to them.
Yeah.
And it didn't appear in earlier manuscripts, and that might be why there's some sort of scholarly consensus. And John seems to think that the church fathers were drawing from something, and they wouldn't have had motivation to add it in because it raised more questions than it answered. So since there's no clear mens rea here, and since there's no clear motivation in order to include it, obviously they were including it because they had to. Kind of. So I have one more question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I do actually dispute the idea that there's no reason to include it myself. I do think that there actually are some good theological reasons for including it, particularly when it comes when it comes
mercy.
to the gospel. Well, that, and then when it comes to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is the most notorious for not giving a rip about Jewish law or Jews in general. So there is also that aspect as well.
Fascinating. Okay. So I have one more question, and then I'll get back to the audience questions because I'm being incredibly selfish right now. So my last question for both of you guys is, so what I'm sort of gleaning from this is that there doesn't seem to be any sort of objective, quantifiable way to come to a determination as to whether or not something is truly authentic, in the sense that we can determine that it's some sort of firsthand account. It's more so a conglomeration of consensus among different transcripts we have available, and what they consisted of, and how that compares to the end product. And now I know that there's this system where there's symbols that kind of demarcated things that were questionable above and beyond that. So aside from some sort of system of probabilities and a bit of conjecture, is there any way to really be objectively certain how any of it came to be, and that any of it was, authentic firsthand accounts?
Well, I think you raise a good point, Shannon, because remember, in the 2nd century, the churches were presented with this exact dilemma. So Marcion is basically saying what many of the modern textual critics are saying today, that the text of Luke, the 10 letters of Paul, in the 2nd century were interpolated by the apostolic churches, by the defenders of Judaism. Because Marcion claimed that the churches were adding all these passages into their scriptures to actually, for theological purposes, to fashion the type of Christ that which support our theological beliefs. So it was all done for theological reasons. So Tertullian was like, okay, well, let's set up an objective test for this criteria, because my position is that the modern textual critic diverts to a more speculative nature to derive at what the original text is. But the ancient church had a much more objective standard. And Tertullian, Irenaeus, both stated, who had to deal with Marcion, they said, well, first, we know the publishing houses of the gospel text. So we know there was churches. So we have Rome and Alexandria. We have all these Greek churches. So the start of the investigation, as in any case, would begin with these churches. So we still have many of these churches. They still exist from the 1st century. We still have Rome. We still have the Antioch church, the Alexandrian church, many of the Greek churches. So Tertullian and Irenaeus says, we need to first start our investigation there because those are closest to the apostles. So the texts that have come through those publishing houses, which are the lines of transmission, begins there. So when we look at the copies that have come down in all these independent streams of Christianity, and you need to think of it as like you're at a trial. You have all these witnesses that are offering up testimony that basically lines up. So in my discussion with Chris, this is what I wanted to formulate. And this is an actual historical case where the churches did it. They said, when we go and investigate the texts that are at these churches, they independently witness to basically the same readings, whereas Marcion's text was unknown to any of these apostolic churches. So the readings in those churches that had come down basically witness against Marcion's text. So when we apply that same historical standard, we look at the same churches. Rome, Milan, the churches in North Africa, they have very early provenance. And we know that there was a system in the churches to set up a transfer and control procedures to guard the successions of the text. So basically preserve the evidence. So when we look at all those, that's why I point to Pacian, who's a bishop in Spain. When we look to Augustine in North Africa, Ambrose in Milan, Didymus in Alexandria, Jerome, all those independent texts that are based on exemplars that have come up through those successions witness to it. So they can source back to those texts. And when we see all these independent witnesses agreeing, in any other normal court of law, that would be conclusive. But in the science of textual criticism, they move to more speculative means. They feel like
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm excited. I have so many questions. And then I've got to ask Milwaukee atheist question.
Real quick,
So
I do disagree that the old church was more objective. Tertullian and Irenaeus, in their refutations of the Gnostics, are proof that they are not objective in their standards by any stretch of the imagination. And also, it's funny you brought up Tertullian, because Tertullian never mentions the pericope adultery. Neither does Irenaeus either.
That was the Milwaukee atheist question, was why does Jonathan think Tertullian left out any reference to the pericope in his book on modesty? And my question is, it seems that you're saying that there was agreed upon consensus amongst multiple churches who were geographically separated from each other. And because they all held the same canon, that is evidence that that canon is authentic. But I mean, wouldn't a reasonable counter argument to that be that if the initial transmission or the agreed upon consensus somehow shifted for any number of political reasons or inaccurate transmission or omission or addition at some point along the line, they would either have to trust through the lines of transmission that they were receiving something accurate, or they would potentially have motivation from a theological standpoint to change, or a political standpoint to change the way that the text was agreed upon and transmitted. And through time, the reasons for that may have been lost, although the consensus remained the same. So I'll pause. I'll mute for a second.
Yeah. So when we look at the Gnostics all said they had the true Gospels. But when we look at all those sects, they all introduce different authors. They all come up with different writings. There's no standardized or uniformity between the Gnostic texts at all. And what Nag Hammadi shows is not only Irenaeus was correct about their teachings in all these texts, but they're all different. Now, if you were a bishop in one of these churches, Shannon, and for some reason you felt that it was important to update the text in that location, well, it's one thing to change that text, but how do you get that changed into North Africa and Spain and all these other places? So if someone came up with the view, because we have to be realistic here, I'm just one church. How do I get it into the church down the street? How do I get it across the way? How do I get it into North Africa and all these other places? Unless it does go back to the original. So you can corrupt your text. How do you get that corruption into other people's texts in other languages? Now, if you had a council where you got them all to come together and do this, that would be different. But we have no record that any such thing like that occurred.
Or it took place over successive centuries.
Yeah, the thing is that the text, the PA doesn't just magically show up in the text. It requires an editor and someone to add it in. And then the problem with it is, while there are some cases where it's in Luke, it's in others, the majority has it in John. So you then have to place it in that exact location of John, which is in the middle of a passage. So how do you get them all to come up with that?
Well, I mean, it just happens over time because, especially if you end up with an early manuscript that added it in. Like, if you're talking like third generation from the original, not many manuscripts have been made yet. So it's pretty easy for yours to become the standard version if you add something in.
But how do you get that into a text on the opposite side of the Roman Empire?
Because you're one of the earliest texts, meaning that people have to copy from your text.
Really? Where did the Greek Orthodox Church copy from the Latin text? They had their own. See,
well, the Latin text had to copy from the Greek text at one point, because John was written in Greek. So at some point they translated it. But I did want to actually note that we do have evidence that they had standardization of texts in other forms, like the infancy Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelion. We have over 150 manuscripts of that text from the, if I remember correctly, from the 5th to the 10th centuries, and they are all ridiculously consistent, and all from different transmission lines. So we do actually have that in non-Orthodox transmission.
But this school of thought hasn't shown where any of that is possible, and that's where the Birdsall study said that all their theories to support the creation of that text has been falsified. So this school of thought doesn't agree with that assertion. And even Kurt and Barbara Allen said that there's no historical verification for what we're saying happened ever did happen. And this is what Dr. Ehrman was readily available to admit. We don't know. We can't explain this. And we can't show that it ever did happen.
I admit I don't think that we can explain it. I think that ultimately we do have to just leave it up to a probability. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, Shannon,
onto the other questions.
Sorry, there's still so many. We're not going to even be able to get to all the audience questions. And for that, I definitely apologize. I monopolized some of it asking my own questions. And that's selfish of me, and I'm sorry. But the next question is from Cam Spires, who has been on this channel with you, John. You've interacted with Cam before. I don't know if you
like
have.
Cam.
I love
Cam's
Cam.
good people.
Cam.
Cam's cool people. All right. So this is from Cam. If not early omission of the PA reorderings and scribal marks accompanying the PA, what evidence would lower your confidence in the PA's authenticity? To John.
Okay. Obviously, if we had a letter from a bishop that was advocating for the passage to be added into different textual traditions. So if there was a fight over hey, this passage needs to be in, because we see that with Augustine and the Donatists on Without Cause. And Jerome was aware of this as well in some of the manuscripts, but didn't put it into his Vulgate translation. So even though Augustine later retracted from those statements, he did have a dispute with the Donatists in the Church of North Africa over the statement Without Cause. Jerome knew about it. So if we had a discussion from any number one of these bishops that actually said that we're trying to campaign for it to get into the text, and they sent out letters and there was disputes and arguments about it, yeah, that would be different. Or if you actually had the Greek and the Western churches get together and then say, hey, we're going to standardize our text between all these independent churches, yeah, I would lose confidence pretty quickly, not only in that passage, but in a number of other passages as well.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to ask one off-topic question, and then I'll give each of you a chance to have a little bit of a closing statement so that we don't just end abruptly. So this question is finally a question for Christopher.
Yay.
Christopher, this is from Reese C. Christopher, where did you steal all those books?
Well, so it's a fun story. I was walking along and I found this guy. He was sitting on the street, had a bunch of bags. And I asked him if he had ever looked on a woman in lust, and he said he had. And so I grabbed a boulder and I smashed it right over his head. And then I took his bag, which were full of a bunch of books, and then I put them on my shelf. And then I went back and I hid the body.
That's a story.
They asked.
That is an answer. That is an answer to that question.
But you know, the more correct and orthodox answer to that, though, is Amazon.
Amazon and eBay. All right, this question is to both of you, and then we'll move on to closing statements. Which Greek god or goddess is your favorite? And that's from Reese C as well.
Man, Greek. I would have to say, maybe Athena.
Ooh, all right. Like the warrior women. All right, Chris. Chris, do you have a favorite Greek god or goddess?
Zeus, for obvious reasons.
He's the boss.
I like his determination. You know, if you can't get laid in human form, turn into a goose.
You do what you gotta do.
I want him as my wingman, so next time I go out and can't get laid, he'll be like, "Oh no, dear, try it as a goose. That'll work."
Fair enough. All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for being such wonderful participants and being so well prepared and adding to this conversation. And I very much appreciate everybody in the chat who participated. This was fantastic. For the record, mine is Dionysus because wine. That's all.
that
because
makes
wine. Because wine. I don't really need another reason. So I'll allow you an opportunity to give your closing statements. And if you could include in your closing statements, because I think it's very important that people understand why we do these types of things, why you think these discussions are important. That would be great. Not to give you directives, but, you know, I'm bossy sometimes. All right. And I will let you go. Who went first? John, you went first, so you can go first. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, well, first I would just like to say thank you for Chris and Shannon for sharing in this conversation. I think it's important for a number of different reasons. I think we need to understand how we got the text of the New Testament that has come down to us today. And I think we need to, in the spirit of science, demonstrate the texts that have come down, whether it's preserved or not. Because if such passages like the woman in adultery, uh, the last 12 verses of Mark, Father forgive them in Luke, and hundreds of other passages were indeed conflated into the text over time, it does undermine the reliability of the New Testament, and then starts to beg the question, is any of the information in the gospel accounts actually reliable? And were there theological motivations to append statements like this, the resurrection, the miracles, all these other things to promote a theological agenda? So that's why over the last 2 years I have studied this. And I think it's important for Christians to understand that facts matter. If these passages were indeed interpolated along with a number of others, then we really need to open up the possibility that a lot of these things could have been invested and what we're believing in is not true. So that's where I definitely see the importance of it. In regards to the PA overall, you know, I have to look at the number of independent witnesses that testify. So for me, I have to explain that by the 4th century, we have independent centers of Christianity that basically witness to the same passage throughout the Mediterranean world in Greek, Latin, and other languages, coming up with the same reading. Otherwise, I have to explain who created the passage, how did they get into the text, and how were they able to get it into numerous textual lines throughout the ancient world in Greek, Latin, Coptic, Aramaic, Bukharic, Ethiopian, Slavonic, without anyone noticing or questioning the passage. And because we actually have independent witnesses that speak to its removal instead of added, in my estimated, in any other court of law, this testimony would be conclusive. And I leave it there.
Thank you so much. All right, Chris, it's your turn. And don't forget, I told you to tell everybody why you think this is important. Don't make me bring up my mom voice. Do a good job.
Sorry, totally forgot. What?
That's why I need my mom voice. Go ahead.
Okay, so the reason I really think that this is actually important, some of it is for similar reasons, as Jonathan points out. When I finally lost my faith in Christianity, one of the things that was a driving force was textual criticism. I didn't feel I could trust the text of the New Testament. Now, I'm not actually fully along the Bart Ehrman's line of things. I do think that Bart is brilliant, but he is very hyperbolic in the way he describes this. I think we can get to the original text in most cases. But the reality for me with this is that I think it's really important, mostly just from the standpoint that particularly when we are talking about us in the atheist community or in the Christian community, when we're debating, we need to know what we're talking about. It does no one any good at all, ever, if we never study these things and we don't know the dates of these manuscripts that we're talking about. We don't know who was writing them, where they were writing them, what language they were writing in. Like, if we don't know these things, how can we be expected to ever convince anyone or present a fluid argument for our positions? It's just going to always end up being fruitless in the end. It always ends up being self-defeating and just makes us seem like ignoramuses. So I think that it is important for us to study these things and to know what we're talking about and to have these discussions as well and to work things out. In terms of the Pericope Adulterae, I don't think it's original. While we do have independent lines that talk about its originality, like Augustine later on, it's they're centuries removed from the originals, and we have to face up to the fact that it's absent in our earliest lines of transmission. It's absent in the majority of the Aramaic, of the Syriac, of the Sahidic. It's absent from the Gothic. It absent from a good number of the Armenian texts, though not the majority. It's absent from the majority of lectionaries, though there are some reasons as to why that is, but not. And then lectionaries that pertain it in their oh crap! I just lost the word. Lectionaries that have it tucked away in the Menologion. Many of them still question its authenticity. I think that is speaking miles. And then the fact that even as far as people who are writing and talking about these passages in the 5th century are still noting their absence, and it's still being absent all throughout these manuscripts. And while this might be explained by people removing it, the fact that so many transmission lines all over the world were omitting it, I think does, especially early on, does speak miles as to it not being original, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thank you, both of you. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. And so I'm going to have to listen back to it later, and I was here.
So quick suggestion, everyone, get a Novum Testamentum Graeci. It's currently 28th edition.
Wow. Okay.
It gives you a physical apparatus with dates of most of our prominent manuscripts and all the good stuff.
I'm so glad you hit that guy with a boulder so that we could all share that book. That's great. So I apologize to the people in the chat whose questions I wasn't able to get to because I like to talk sometimes and I wanted to ask my own questions. I'm sorry. And for everybody who did participate and watch, thank you so much. And especially to these two, to Chris and John, please go check out and subscribe to their channels. They're in the description. Thank you to Paulogia, who was in the chat aggregating comments. Please go subscribe to his channel too. It's fantastic. And Modern Day Debate, who is antagonizing the chat. Go subscribe to his channel too, because you'll see these two there, and me and Paul from time to time. So thank you, everybody. And as always, help elevate the discourse.